the annelids, which means ringed in Latin. Many of you who, if you took high school biology and learned something about invertebrates and about worms, the annelids were divided up into three classes. The polychaetes, which were marine, the oligochaetes, which were like earthworms, and the hierodinians, which were leeches a few years back. And now it's all changed because of DNA sequencing. A whole lot, but polychaetes are synonymous with annelids now. So we're going to just call all these polychaetes because that's all we're going to be studying here for the segmented worm. They do have a complete digestive tract. They have a mouth, they have a stomach, they have an intestine, they have an anus. They have a closed circulatory system. They have blood pigments. Now, many of them have hemoglobin, just like you have. Hemoglobin is an iron-containing pigment, and the iron is bound in a molecular structure called a heme. And when it's oxygenated, as you know, it's bright red, and when it's not carrying oxygen, it is blue. Well, there's some other blood pigments. There's one called chlorocruorin, which is kind of hard to get your mouth around. And it is iron containing, much like hemoglobin, but the heme, the molecular structure around the iron is a little bit different. Not a whole lot, just a few molecules different. But the big difference is when it's oxygenated, it is bright green. And when it's deoxygenated, no oxygen, it's kind of brownish or rust colored. And it's present in two families of worms, both of which we can find down on the intertidal zone. And I'll point those out when we get shortly. And then there's another pigment called hemerythrin, which is iron containing, but it's not, the iron is not bound up in the heme molecule, even though the name implies that it is. And when it has oxygen in it, it's red. When it doesn't, it's clear. There's a few worms that have that. All these worms have two front segments. The first two segments, these are all segmented worms. The first two characterized by the prostomium, which is the first one, which has lots of little antennae and projections on it. And then the peristomium, which if you translate that, it means around the mouth, is like a collar. It has no projections on it. And I'll point this out on the next slide, called the peristomium, and it's the second segment. And then after that, all the segments have small projections off to the side called parapodia. Podia refers to foot, that contain these hair-like structures. It's called cheta, or bristles. Now, some of these polychaetes, especially in some of the families like the Nereids, have a rather spectacular and strange reproductive method called epitoky. Now, there are males and females. Sexes are separate. So, at certain times of the year, at nighttime, usually under a full moon, the right phase of the moon anyway, these non-reproductive individuals will suddenly change into a reproductive individual, and they will actually change shape, get really weird looking. They're called a heteronereid, or sexual individual. And then at the right time, they will all swarm. The males and females will swarm together. And there'll be thousands and thousands of them swarming. And this happens often in the tide pools or in the bays. As the female bodies rupture, they release all the eggs. The males spawn all together, and they fertilize the eggs. Then all these adults die. within a couple of hours.
And Jim, they often bioluminesce while they're doing it as well.
Yes, they do.
So
Many of them will be fluorescent. Okay, then many of these worms are armed with a proboscis, something they can shoot out their mouth end for capturing prey or defense. Okay, here's some of the worms we'll see. This is the mussel worm. Remember I talked about the microhabitat in between all the mussels on the rocks, those California mussels. Well, this particular worm lives pretty much solely in that microhabitat. Nereis vexillosa. Okay, here's the clam worm, mainly in the bay. And this is the prostomium, this first segment here at the head end, with all these little antennae and projections coming from it. And then this is the peristomium, the collar segment. And then beyond that are all these segments with the parapodia, the little feet on the sides with their bristles. And then this is the sandworm, which you'll find on the beach, living in the sand. And this particular one has its proboscis extended. Now, a lot of these worms look an awful lot alike. When you're trying to identify them, you have to look at the shapes of the parapodia, the armament on the proboscis. It gets pretty complicated. Okay, here's some other worms you'll see down in the rocky intertidal that are a little bit different, but they're still polychaetes, segmented. One is the free-living 18 scale worm. There are several types of scale worms. These have scales on their backside, and usually you find them crawling around under rocks and so on. Here's another scale worm, the ruffled scale worm, that is symbiotic with starfish. And very often you'll find it on the bottom side or the oral side of starfish. And this particular one was right between the arms of the starfish, right in here. Another worm we'll see down there, which is encrusting and builds these calcareous tubes, is the red trumpet worm. And it and this feather duster worm, which we'll see down there, are the ones that have the green blood. They belong to the families Serpulidae and Sabellidae. You don't have to remember that. These feather duster worms, we'll see the tubes down there. Usually when the tide goes out, they will retract down inside their tubes. So you actually won't see these feathers, which are the gills, which are used for both breathing and for feeding. Affinity for this particular worm, because when I was a researcher, I was researching heavy metals in the marine environment, copper in particular, for a number of years, and this was my lab rat, I guess you might say. This is the animal I used for looking at the effects of copper on its physiology and anatomy and so on.
These two particular worms that you just talked about in the tide pool area, we often don't see them with their gills out. Sometimes they're a little bit out. But the feather duster worm has more of a soft casing, right? And the
it's kind of leather-like.
Yeah, the trumpet worm is a little bit harder, right?
It is hard. It's calcareous. The feather duster worm has kind of a leather-like tube. It's about as big around as your finger, and these tubes can actually, these tubes are in big clusters, they can be up to a foot long or more. So this array of gills can be maybe a couple inches across. And let's see.
Yeah, I know that I misidentified them as like thinking that they were the remnants of a gooseneck barnacle before,
Yeah.
right? So I remember.
It's easy to make that mistake. Okay, another worm we may see the live ones down there. I found a couple of groups of them down there on occasion. But what you'll find on the beach very often is this stuff that looks like a coral. And this is called the Pacific fission worm. And they secrete this coral-like matrix. And they're called the fission worms because there's usually a father or mother worm, I guess, whichever one you want to call it, that settles out on the rock. It starts to secrete this skeletal matrix on the outside of it, and then it reproduces by fission. So there'll be a couple of daughter worms, and those daughter worms will divide again into granddaughter worms and ad infinitum until we get a whole colony. And these colonies can be so big that they actually form underwater reefs. And so we'll find chunks of the reefs washed up on the beach. And these are pretty common. People say, oh, we have coral here. But no, it's not coral. Usually the worms are not in them, but sometimes they are. I did pick up one time a chunk about this. It may have been the same chunk, I'm not sure. I picked it up on the beach, stuck it in my backpack, kind of forgot about it, and then opened my backpack a couple of weeks later, and there's a gooey mess in the bottom from all the worms that came out. But usually most of the worms are gone by the time they get rolled around up on the beach. Any questions about polychaetes?
There was a question about bioluminescence, and do they bioluminesce every month?
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, my sense was that it was a certain time of year.
At a certain time of year, yeah.
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 But I wasn't.
But, bioluminescence isn't always related to the reproduction either of some of these animals. So it could be, I'm not specific, I'm not specifying the worm in particular, but other animals can bioluminesce when they're disturbed.
True.
You can go out at the beach at nighttime. I've done this in Netarts Bay. Stomp on the sand, and there's a little microorganism called a dinoflagellate that will bioluminesce, and it looks like fireworks in the sand when you stomp on the sand.
It's really beautiful. I have not seen it really well out here in Oregon, but I have seen it on the East Coast.
I've seen it in Netarts Bay. We had a party down there one night, and all the kids were stomping on the sand looking at the fireworks. Okay, another type of worm. This is not a polychaete. It's in its own phylum called the Nereis. This is the sea nymph worm. It's not segmented. And it also has a proboscis, but the proboscis is not part of the gut. It's not part of the mouth structure. It's above the mouth structure. And it's a predatory worm. And at the end of the proboscis is a stylet that does contain a toxin. And when it's feeding, it will use a hydrostatic pressure to shoot this proboscis out into a prey item and paralyze it, and then it draws it back towards the mouth. They are in the intertidal area, in the rocky intertidal area. If you go to our website, I've got a couple of them I found out there. And then this particular one, the Wanderer, the purple ribbon worm, is in Netarts Bay. And then I put this one up here. This is a special Nemerian, kind of different from the others. that inhabits razor clams. Put your thumbs up if you've like razor clamming or go razor clamming. If you do, you'll find that about 10, maybe 15% of the razor clams have this worm inside it, usually attached to the inside near the base of the intake siphon. The clam neck has two siphons in it, two channels for bringing water into the clam and taking water out of the clam. And this attaches itself to the base of the intake siphon. And what it does is it's capturing food that the clam isn't taking in for itself, and it's just capturing food items. And this little windy structure is the gut, and the rest of the structure is probably gonads. And probably when a lot of people who catch their razor clams and clean them and so on don't notice these things. And so probably a lot of you or other people who have eaten razor clams have eaten this worm as well. But if you fry it up, it's fine. Okay, this is the last of the worms. This is the flatworms, the Platyhelminthes, which in Greek means flat worms. Now this phylum includes flukes like liver flukes, parasitic worms, tapeworms, and so on. But there are some free-living varieties, and the one we have here we'll find in the intertidal areas this polyclad, which means many branches, and it has a gut that has lots of branches to it. It's free-living. It can be either a scavenger, carnivore, or it may eat plants. Usually it's found under things. It doesn't like direct sunlight, but you'll find this flat thing just gently crawling along surfaces. Are there any questions or comments on today's session?
We got an ew from eating a worm and the razor clams.
You will never even know it.
You've enjoyed them so far, so.
I have. Although, because I'm curious about them, I look for them.
Yeah, and the size that some of these worms can get to is pretty fascinating. I mean, some of these are very small, but some of these can actually be quite large.
Some of these ribbon worms can actually be a couple feet long, 4 inches, something like that. They can also be very colorful. The ones we have around here, at least the ones I found, are not so.
Yeah, they really can. They're very beautiful, actually, and
Yeah,
also very like.
And some of them can be a couple feet long.
Yeah, they're crazy little